Oh, could you hear me?
Yeah, we could hear you.
Because I couldn't
Mm-hmm.
hear you. Okay, let me plug it in again because you could hear me, but I couldn't hear you. Keep talking.
Hi, 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 hi,
I'm
hi,
trying to think
hi.
of the podcast name. It's a
Hello,
No,
good
hi.
name.
it's a high podcast. The wannabe, but we didn't.
Oh. Before starting this podcast, the members would like to do a small land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the Haldimand Tract, traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Thank you. And hello, welcome to the Deserving versus Undeserving podcast. Today I am with three beautiful individuals, Haley, Sherry, and Belinda. And we're going to be talking about some themes that we learned from class and just sharing our thoughts and feelings about them. And yeah, so how are we doing today, everybody?
Tired, good, excited to be here.
Mm-hmm. What's everybody drinking tonight if you have a drink?
I have some wine with some bubbly in it.
I've just got water right now.
Yeah, I'm a water.
Mm-hmm.
Coffee. It's Monday.
Ooh, yep. Definitely need it. So should we get right off into the first question?
Do it.
All right. Poverty. How is it discussed and how is it experienced? How do we, as a society, talk about poverty? Does anyone want to go first?
I could start. Thanks, Will.
Okay.
Immediately when you asked the question, I was thinking about a paper we read in class by Charles Cole, and the paper was Understanding Income Inequality, that social and cultural values affect individual social economics. So I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking, so how it's discussed and how it's experienced is really a social construct. So it's very much based on dominant social norms. So that means that it can really, by society, change. Perspective in one country or one culture may see someone as impoverished, and so another culture may see it as a normative. So I think we have to start there, that these things are, the dominant discourse is what drives the conversation publicly, even though that isn't necessarily the truth. And then the second thing I'm thinking of is, for the namesake of this podcast, we're talking about the deserving versus the undeserving poor. And that idea, is really rooted back in Elizabethan poor laws of 1601, and the idea that the dominant society gets to decide who's deserving and undeserving. Who, if you're able-bodied or seemingly able-bodied, then you were undeserving poor. Or you didn't deserve supports. Whereas now, we also know that in the same time, elderly and those with disabilities were considered perhaps more deserving. And that still rings through today.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Like when we think back to the undeserving versus undeserving poor, like it's very much written like if you're able-bodied, then you don't deserve it. So why, like, if you're able to work, why can't you? Yes, Haley.
Yeah, I feel like in our society, people are often valued based on their productivity and their work life. Discussions around poverty are like often framed using this logic, and folks are evaluated on this very narrow measure of worth. Like in our one of our first readings by Jim Stanford, he talked about how economics is more than just finance and profits and markets, that the economy should also kind of be about the other types of work we perform, including, what we do to produce more than just money. So like cooking for your family is valuable work. Spending time with others is valuable work. Comforting people, connecting with people, those are like valuable contributions to the community that we don't acknowledge when we talk about poverty.
Goes to show the line of work that we've chosen, literally making connections with people. Belinda, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, just to go off of that, Stanford also defines GDP as like another way to measure poverty because that's usually typically how society measures poverty, but it's also it doesn't encompass all of poverty. Again, it's just adding up all the different goods, services that are produced for money. It only measures the total value of work and doesn't count volunteered and unpaid work. And it's oftentimes poverty is defined as being criminalized. If you can't afford basic needs, it affects your health and well-being. Sherry, I believe, also had a point.
You know, when I look back at these conversations, and we're just talking about the dominant discourse of our society, and as I said earlier, if we invited other cultures and countries and dominant narratives in their societies into this conversation, it could look very differently. But what is interesting, though, is that despite knowing more and knowing that poverty is a social determinant of health, and those that are educated understand this, that poverty is not something that one elects and signs up for, we still have policies in place at the government level that ascribe to this Elizabethan poor law mentality. For example, Ontario Works is one such social welfare program that exists, and yet it's supposed to provide financial assistance for those in need, yet poses incredible pressure on individuals receiving it. Those people actually lose all sorts of rights of privacy and are constantly scrutinized and surveyed just because they're on that support. And so it's just a reminder that poverty also is, really the state of poverty leaves people open to being victims of the state.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And often people fall through the cracks and don't have the chance to even say I need help. Any other points anyone wants to make? Okay. So next question or next follow-up question, what is this discussion or what is this conversation missing? Sure, Haley, go ahead.
I think when we discuss poverty, it's framed as a personal failing rather than an issue that's based in any sort of societal systems or structures. It's often discussed with so much personal and emotional distance, and these conversations can really lack humanity and empathy. There's an article from week 2 where a journalist looked into why we assume that poor people are poor because of bad choices. And the article talked a lot about the fundamental attribution error, which is the tendency to see the behavior of other people as being determined by their character while attributing your own to circumstances. So people are convinced that when someone is poor or rich, that they've done things to deserve that. But they make an exception in that logic for themselves. So I'm poor because bad things have happened to me, essentially. And interestingly, that article it's older, but it actually brings up J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, which is probably one of the ultimate expressions of fundamental attribution error. He's poor and struggling because of external factors, but everyone he grew up with is poor, and he believes it's because of a lack of their work ethic. And this article is 7 years old, but this man is now Trump's VP. So yeah, obviously these discussions are still missing empathy for others.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. They don't really take in the human element to poverty. When we think about it, we all have those bad days, and sometimes those days can be extended for longer periods of time. And that could be so unforgiving in today's day and age. Does anyone have anything to follow that up? Yeah, Belinda, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna quote Jeanette in our final lecture we had. She was saying that we need to do more than just help poor people cope with being poor. Research can be used as a tool for social justice and it can transform people's minds and policies. There needs to be more research on poverty alleviation and how it can be attainable, such as basic income. How can federal and provincial government social policies change to help alleviate poverty? Also, how can poverty be solved peacefully using ethos? By identifying social structures and power structures in society, such as capitalism, individualism, and racism, which we'll talk about further in our podcast. They can help prevent larger scale poverty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to kind of go off that, right? Like, I think a lot of confusion can happen when you hear minimum wage versus basic income, which they kind of sound similar, but like with reflecting with everything that we talked about in class, they are very much different. Like minimum wage, like that screams like the like lower than basic needs. And to me, that isn't right. And I think there does need to be a push for basic income. Yes, Sherry.
I'm going to slide a little bit back over. I absolutely agree that basic income is an essential part of the solutions that need to be put in place. And we were speaking just a moment ago about some of the discourse that's missing. What are the conversations that are missing? What are we not talking about? And we look at poverty and we talk about poverty in this podcast that it's its own isolated issue, but really it's an issue like all other issues that intersect. It's not just talking about intersectionality or social location. I'm talking about the fact that it intersects with numerous other social welfare policies and numerous social issues. Whether, for example, right away I'm thinking of the patient dumping and the video that we saw on that,
Yeah, I
and that
remember
it
that.
is intersects over to things like healthcare. And if I have economic challenges, it's that in itself is a barrier to all other um, social programs,
Mm-hmm.
right? I can't afford a phone, for example, so I can't look up and find resources in the community, or I can't afford my bus fare to get to a job. And so it becomes it's so all encompassing, and people just look at it narrowly, and that's very, very disturbing that way.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, and yeah, like I think poverty and just finances in general are like a huge factor in a lot of today's difficulties, like with mental health. Like I know for me as a student, and I'm sure like everybody here and everybody in our classes can say like they worry about their finances too, on top of school and everything. Like I'm not working, so like I'm using up all my savings to be here. And I know that could be very strenuous. And thank God I have the support systems that I have. Otherwise, I would be going mad. Okay, but moving along, our last question for this portion. Poverty isn't only an economic status. What emotional, mental experiences are caused by poverty? And I think we kind of just discussed that a little bit, but does anyone else have any points they want to add to that discussion? Sure, Haley, go ahead.
Yeah, like I think Sherry definitely brought up the fact that poverty affects other elements of our life, like our health. I think just generally speaking, poverty is just a physically and mentally exhausting process. There's so much time and effort that goes into navigating a world without enough money, going to appointments, filling out paperwork, accessing resources, transportation. All these things have time and energy costs associated with them, and we tend to forget the amount of work it takes to survive when you're living in poverty. I'm maybe not so much a social worker since we're often tasked with some of that work, but I've thought about that a lot when I'm working with a client and thinking about how difficult it is to fill out some of these forms and how much time it takes. And if you make a mistake and you need to fill it out again, and then, you know, like sometimes it can only be faxed and who has access to a fax machine, and there's all of these things, and we as social workers realize how much time it can take, but I don't think most people understand that element of poverty.
Sherry, do you have something to follow that up with?
Thank you. Well, Haley, that was really important what you just said. And I think, filling out paperwork, right? We can associate that with education, for example. If you haven't had the opportunity for education because you've just been on a survival mode, you may not be able to understand some of this what we would all agree, I think, is some very complicated paperwork, and we're university educated. And then I think of things like the points that Rutger Bregman brought up in his TED talk titled Poverty Isn't a Lack of Character, It's a Lack of Cash. And he emphasized the stress related to poverty can actually reduce a person's IQ temporarily. Like, it's not that because you're impoverished or you live in a state of poverty that you have a lower IQ. It's really that the cognitive functioning, the distress, as you mentioned earlier about that the stress of being economically strapped can reduce your intellectual ability, which is fascinating when you apply it to, for example, the student population. How many more students could do better in the student space in the educational environment if they didn't have to worry about finances constantly? So that was sort of my take on that. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
I think you summarized it great. I was going to talk about that survival mode piece, and you already touched on that. Like, people living in poverty are isolated and disconnected. That sense of belongingness and inclusion in society is a very concerning issue. Like, I think of, when we go to class, we see all the time homeless populations. And, sometimes I try my best to like say hi or acknowledge them because they are people too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we feel alone, that's when we suffer the most, right? And we often are so not self-absorbed, but thinking about ourselves. And it makes it hard to take that time to like really acknowledge your fellow person, right? I was going to say fellow man, but come on, we're in 2024. Let's get real here. But okay. So let's move on to our next point of discussion, poverty, identity, and intersectionality, with our first question. Why do you think some populations are at increased risk of economic disparity?
I can start.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So cycles of poverty exist and it's hard to escape. In Neville's article, he writes about how there are active and passive types of social inclusion. Active inclusion is when there is a deliberate social policy that excludes people from certain opportunities, such as people trying to escape living in poverty. An individual not getting their basic needs met can have multiple origins, partially due to social exclusion.
Right, right. And I think with that article, um, like, yeah, for me, like just the not getting the basic needs because of social exclusion, like it's insane to me that we're still like that people can still experience that nowadays with all this talk of like trying to be more inclusive and more community outreach and it just drives me crazy. Sherry.
Yeah, Charles Cole again speaks into some of the challenges that relate to this, right? Talks about the direct correlation between education as a determinant of higher paying jobs in the future. So once again, we see that cycle, the connection between the various barriers, right? Education means better job means income security.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Haley?
Yeah, I think like we can't really have these conversations without like acknowledging certain things. Like there's hegemonic values and ideologies that maintain the dominance of certain groups in our world over other groups. And in a society where economic status is very highly associated with power, the systems are built so that those who have like historically had power keep it. And of course, like this is very generally like white, cis, able men, which leaves those of non-dominant identities to be actively disempowered by the structures in place. And the idea that anybody can work themselves out of poverty, like i.e. pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and the idea that those who have wealth have worked harder than those without it, those both maintain the current neoliberal system that we have. And I think especially in North America, we can't separate like capitalism from its racist heritage. And like our society was built on racialized oppression, and for this reason, like the system continues to contribute to racial inequity. I think we've discussed in class like poverty is highly racialized. In week 7, we reviewed those fact sheets. I think they were called "The Color of Poverty," which highlighted the economic disparities between Indigenous and racialized groups compared to white people. And I mean, we have a legacy of slavery and colonization here, which has created systemic racism in our institutions, and that disadvantages Black, racialized, and Indigenous folks that we now as social workers like often work with, and we see that inequity.
Yeah, and with I think with everything you just said, like, yeah, there is a lot of disparity in our society, and like the idea of pulling up your bootstraps, like that's something I think my dad has told me at one point, and I'll probably tell my kid when they like have something they want to work towards, put in hard work and you'll get the result. But that's like for something short term. Whereas something longer term, like escaping poverty, I don't think that saying goes anywhere, should be anywhere near that, because that has way different challenges that are way more systemic. Like if you're just talking like financial poverty, we're talking like if you're in debt, then you have to pay off certain bills, and that accrues interest, and like navigating that is a whole endeavor in and of itself. And so that bootstrap saying, I don't think is one that should be applied to this. Okay. Anyone else want to say anything, or are we ready to move on? Okay. Next question. Intersectionalities, those marginalized, are at greater risk of poverty. Statistics and facts. Anybody have anything they want to share?
I wrote down, age is an influential aspect of poverty that intersects with it, because the systems distribute funding, and I also think of like the difference distinguished between, children's disabilities and adult disability services, for instance, and the funding again, we talked about slavery earlier, so like the child labor laws are different as well. That plays an aspect of poverty.
Mm-hmm. And I think with that too, I think there have been, I know in some in some other countries like France, they're trying to change like the age of retirement, like when somebody can access like their funds. I think that may have happened here. I'll have to research that. But I know like that number is ever changing, and that can be incredibly difficult for people who are right at the cusp of being able to like retire officially, and like they need that money for whatever reason, and they can't get access to it because the government has said, oh, you're not old enough. Haley, go ahead.
Oh, just to speak to your example, they did try very hard to do that in France and did not succeed because the riots were so intense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you don't do that. You don't do that in
Mm-hmm.
France. But yeah, I think it's tough because in a world where it's difficult to age well with the money that you have often. Like the average sort of middle class worker who has worked their whole life, like it can be difficult, especially for women who like live longer than men. We have to like cover even more years with and that's taking into account like the gender pay gap as well. But it's difficult because sometimes you have to work way past like a normal retirement age, but it's also like kind of a ridiculous premise that you are required in order to live to work that late into life.
Sherry, do you have something to add?
Well, I just think as probably one of the older students in this discussion, of course, I'm mindful of things like retirement and what that means and what it will take to make that possible. Of course, I'm also grounded in the understanding that retirement is largely something that's actually quite recent, right? It's not something that was always, and very much part of the westernized philosophy. So letting go a little bit of the social normatives around retirement. But you're absolutely right. Well, the system has been designed for, and Haley mentioned it too, the system's designed by and for a predominantly white male population and their expectations. So when we think of things like my mother, for example, who passed away around this time last year, and her husband, basically he decided he didn't want to take care of her in her final days, and so he left, and that just emphasized and really underscored the dominance of the way the male, the misogynistic and patriarchal powers, that somebody can be committed to somebody else for a very long time and then it's an inconvenience. So what happened was that became a financial strain on her. He was part of her support system financially. She was not in a position to fight for equality as far as the finances go, and it was her final days. So it really was complicated for her and for the family, and really, really alarming to see it play out. And we've seen that apparently when I was talking to the hospital, this is common. That is very, very common that a woman will stand beside her man during his final days and provide health care that he needs. Whereas there is a very notable trend towards men bailing during those times and leaving the women to struggle. And that in itself can impoverish a woman very quickly, especially if it's an enduring illness, for example.
Men, am I right? And thank you for being so open with us, Sherry. You have my condolences, and I'm sorry that your mom had to go through that experience. And Sherry, 35 isn't that old. Come on now. Okay, so before we move on to the next point, does anybody have any specific populations that they want to discuss as examples? Sure, Haley, go ahead.
I think I'll just sort of expand a little bit on what we've been discussing, which is gender. I think we it's fairly obvious how poverty disproportionately affects women, just by looking at the gender wage gap. And then that gap is, in like kind of looking at an intersectional perspective, that gap is much bigger when we look at racialized women as well. But in addition to that inequality of wages, there are just huge barriers that work to keep women in poverty. And Sherry just discussed some. And one of the ones I'm thinking of as well is like the gendered expectations of caretaking and parenting, which often mean that women have less time or ability to even be employed. And so that can make it difficult when, those caretaking duties are not needed anymore, or like you don't have a partner around anymore and you do need to become employed. That's a huge barrier. And then, like you're more likely to have to access social assistance because of that type of unpaid labor in the first place. And I think one of the week 3 readings, Kendra Coulter discussed that the lack of access many women have to employment and money leaves them really vulnerable. We see this in how many women can just not afford to leave very abusive situations. And research has even shown that men use welfare policies very specifically to leverage and control their partners.
I actually didn't know that. I knew from a psychological perspective how or why some women stay in abusive relationships and vice versa too. But I was completely unaware that that financial and even through policies they can keep people in as well. I think that's insane. Anybody, Belinda or Sherry, do you have any examples that you want to discuss before we move on?
I just wanted to add in we hadn't mentioned some of the other intersectionalities, and we could go on in a whole conversation that we could consume more than an hour's time just talking about intersectionalities and the effect of poverty and how it has a compounding effect. But I specifically want to recognize the LGBTQ2S plus communities who are very much at risk of the effects of poverty simply because of their social location. They're also at heightened risk of mental health problems, again, because of the barriers and oppressive forces that are upon them. So when we think of, the interaction of mental health problems and then income disparity, it's just a tsunami that continues to have this compounding effect and increases the burden that they already have in society. Kia and colleagues specifically talks about that population and certainly identifies individuals are at a significant risk, and this is something that needs to be addressed socially.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Belinda?
I meant to say this earlier, but it touches on kind of our next question as well. Those that live with disabilities. We mentioned as well in class the disability without poverty movement. It's a grassroots movement for people living with disability. It's meant to support families, service provider, allies, and organizations. It focuses on mobilizing the voices of people experiencing disabilities. It's supposed to shape Canadian disability benefit and secure public support for ending disability poverty. I think of when I was personal carried, like when I would go work directly with people and go in their homes, like how I would see that, visible poverty, especially like in, when I would make food for them, like how limited some of their income was. Like it's not, at least what I've seen in COVID, employment income assistance is not enough, especially when you're living with a disability.
Absolutely. And speaking on that, I used to work for a housing organization in Barrie, where I'm from, for intellectually and developmentally delayed individuals. And I know that's one form of disability, but sometimes people aren't able to take care of people who require those specific needs, and so those organizations are great to have. But last year, they had to shut down a bunch of houses because it wasn't affordable. And I think that's such a huge shame because being in those houses, people need that kind of support structure because their families can't provide them. And this is nothing against their families. There's nothing wrong with that. Like if you're at risk of being hurt by your loved one because they can't understand what it is that they're doing, then that's nothing on you. They've tried and they couldn't handle it. And so having those services is great, but when they're taken away, that's such a huge shame, and it only leaves the people who need it the most to suffer. Okay, so since Belinda mentioned our next question, our next area of topic is alleviating poverty, charity, and basic income. So our first question, what is the current approach to to poverty alleviation. Sure, Haley, go ahead.
I mean, I think overall the current approach is, that one of austerity, so it's minimal. The eligibility standards are like unreasonable, and we're currently relying very heavily on nonprofits and charities. And a large part of that is because both social assistance and wages for most work are stagnant, and this has been creating an expanding group of people who are now living in poverty. So like we see a very huge number of people who are working poor or very vulnerable. And then I think any of us who have had clients on social assistance know that you cannot actually live genuinely on social assistance in any real way. So, the government has increasingly relied on charities to address social issues and then that's allowed them to systematically defund welfare, health, education. Something I think about a lot is in 1989, my mom was on welfare as a single parent, and she received about $11,500 a year. And then in 2022, when I was working and I was supporting young single parents at CAS, it was $13,600. So it had gone up $1,100 in 30 years. And like we know that based on inflation, that $1 in 1989 had the purchasing power of about $2 in 2022. So the cost of life had doubled, but welfare had increased by that tiny amount. And yeah, that discussion came up with my mom multiple times, where she just had trouble believing that it had gone up that little since she had received it.
Belinda, go ahead.
We didn't really talk about this in class, but there's a really powerful memoir and series called Made, and I instantly thought of that when you were talking about your mom's situation. It's about a single parent, and there's a scene where she's with a child. It's called at Manitoba Child Family Services. It's called here CAS. But anyways, she's with her worker, and they're talking about getting housing and childcare, and how in order to get housing, you have to work, but in order to work, you have to get childcare. But how do you get childcare if you're not working? And it's like this constant, pivoting and trying to find different services when you can't even access them in the first place. You need to access a different service to get there. It's like this moment where she's like, "What fuckery is this?" She literally says that. It's crazy.
And I think there's a lot of cycles like that, like the one you mentioned. In order for you to get these services, you need to work, and in order for you to work, you need childcare, and in order for you, like that. And in today's age, like with us, like trying to get into the workforce, we need we need a job to get work experience, but we need work experience to get a job. And so those kind of cycles, I think, are way too common in our day and age. And I think something needs to break, otherwise the people will. Okay, so that kind of leads into our next topic. Or Sherry, do you have anything that you want to discuss before we move on?
No, thank you. I think they've covered some facts pretty nicely.
Okay. What are promising solutions and practices? Sherry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm thinking when we talk about solutions, we're looking at, for example, Curtis and Rybczynski, sounds like a good Polish name. 2004 is an article that we covered in class, and it explains that higher education increases the likelihood of exiting to a higher income, yet higher education leads to higher, and then of course the higher education leads to higher paying jobs. But they also point out that the longer one is in poverty, the less likely one is to exit poverty. So intervention needs to be early, and that's where right away that the phrase universal basic income pops up in my mind, and it's a proven approach to leaving poverty. For example, I look at the lecture by Dennis Raphael, a professor at York University, and he explained in his lecture that in the Scandinavian countries, they're leading the way in economic and social security, and they're genuinely committed to the social equity. They essentially they're walking the talk, and this includes having a basic income strategy in place that is working. And we know that we've tested the basic income strategy in our own country. We just actually, well, to our great disappointment, Canada's not stacking up very well. And they're not moving forward in investigating this at this time because as recent as September 24th of this very year, Bill C-223, an act to develop a national framework for guaranteed livable basic income, was read in Parliament, and it didn't pass. So can you imagine the difference it would have made if every person had enough money to afford at least a basic life essentials such as food, a safe place to sleep at night, clothing on our body. All of those things should be a basic human right. People should be not begging or falling through the cracks, and a universal basic income would address this.
Mm-hmm. And I remember, I think one of the articles we read discussed the Universal Basic Income project that happened in Thunder Bay. And I think that's such a huge community to like start that with, because there's so many like indigenous people like living there, and I think that's such a huge opportunity, and it just sucks that it fell through. Like that's such a huge blow. Belinda?
Evelyn Forget's video was kind of already mentioned, but to further Sherry's point, like she talks about how the case for basic income is possible. If the Canadian government tries to give basic income, it will result in reducing rates of poverty, including homelessness. And just to take it home, like there's so many layers of poverty that needs to be looked at and analyzed to alleviate it, like childcare, food, housing, and water. There's different needs and different kinds of situations to consider.
Right. And I think with one of those measures to consider is the like physical model, or like not physical, but like the business end of it. Like I remember in one of our class discussions, somebody had discussed the like different camps that Tim Hortons provides, and their kids like utilized that and they had a great time with it. And I'm like, this is what I want. This is what I would actually like if somebody at like if they ask me in a Tim Hortons line, do I want to donate? Then yeah, I want to donate because I'm actually seeing what I'm donating to. Like, yes, there are faceless organizations that have good causes, but like I feel like there are so many that you don't really see the output. And so I would want to see like more local like organizations like that where you actually see the benefit that you're giving into. Sherry?
Your thoughts are very common. It's actually a very dominant narrative. People want evidence, and evidence costs money. So that is a problem in itself, because if we spend our efforts and energy and finances on creating the impact reports, if you will, to prove that these things are working, or prove that the need exists, or prove that we are addressing the cause, then that's energy and money and time that could be spent actually directly addressing the need. And this is something that I think people are kind of chasing their tail with. But I think of oh goodness, Haley, you and Belinda, I lost my train after that. Sorry.
That's okay.
It might come back. I'll let you know.
Okay. Does anybody else have any points they want to add before we continue?
Oh, yes. Sorry. It
Go
came
ahead.
back. It came
Awesome.
back. We're going to call it a menopausal moment and enjoy it. What we've just been talking about in the last few moments is really about creating that foundational piece that says, you know what, no matter what, you're not going to sink. And we've also talked about the stress earlier in our conversation about the stress and the mental health consequences, not just And we haven't even touched on the physical implications of poverty. So what we're now talking about is foundation needs to be set. People need to feel safe because people need to feel safe to grow from. So if we have a foundational piece in place, like a guaranteed income benefit, where people know no matter what, you are not going to be sleeping on the streets, no matter what, you're going to have food in your belly, you're going to be safe, it's okay, then people can grow from that. And we know that's truth. And then what happens is we need that next layer that says we need individualistic solutions that make sure that the individual needs of every person, because we're all unique beings, are addressed. We are so very far from these solutions, but that would be my own vision, is that it would be multi-layered with a very strong foundational piece.
Wow, Sherry, very insightful, very, very thoughtful. Haley?
I think, yeah, just going off a little bit about what Sherry just said, she sort of spoke to this like very intense stress, and that, some of these programs, like, knowing that you're not going to be sleeping on the street is a very powerful thing. Like, it reduces a lot of stress. And I often in these conversations hear people, talking about how basic income is going to disincentivize people from work, but I don't think that they realize that it is not incentivizing, like survival, like not being afraid of whether you're going to survive is not a good incentive. Like, that is not, it's paralyzing. It doesn't convince people to work. It's just traumatic. And I think people get, like, the way that they talk about it, they discuss it like it, like that's what it is. Like, this need to eat and this need to have a roof over your head, that's what's going to make you want to work. Which is just wild, because it's, there's good stress and there's bad stress, and that is the ultimate bad stress, and it does nothing good for anybody.
Yeah, I never thought about it that way. Like, I like the push to make somebody work. Like, yeah, if you want to eat, you got to work. Like, okay, am I gonna get like basic scraps from the work I do, or am I gonna get like a full course steak dinner at the end of the day? And yeah, that's not a good like motivator to work. And I think that's a very valid point. Okay, so next question. What are the drawbacks and concerns with charity-based solutions and business solutions?
I'll
Belinda?
just be really brief.
Yeah.
Automatically, when I think of the charity model, I think of like Catholicism and like, having to do like this pilgrimage with, and helping the deserving poor, right? That religious aspect, that heroism, right? And how you have to sacrifice in order to like rise to the top. I was raised Catholic, so that's what I was taught. But obviously, further my social work career and stuff, there's so many like things that is wrong. I'm going to be honest with those thoughts. And I'm sure other people can talk about that as well. But there needs to be more, you know, um, where Justin Chang came into class, which Sherry is going to discuss, that social enterprise. There needs to be more social enterprise to consider.
Hmm. And going off the religious and heroism, like when, coming from a historical perspective, like that's what we thought we were doing when we were first coming into Canada and settling and helping the indigenous population, helping in air quotes, by teaching them our language and teaching, again in air quotes, and teaching them our language. And that's what the mindset was then. And it wasn't very helpful in the long run. And it was very damaging and very, very, very messed up. Sherry?
Thanks, Will. And thanks, Belinda, for bringing up, Justin Chan's lecture. I'm going to touch on that in a moment.
Mhm.
But first, I'm going to swing back over to just the idea of a charity-based solution, which is what we predominantly have at this point. And it can be great. It can provide a quick Band-Aid. I'm not going to say that there is ill intent in all of those spaces. There's some very genuine organizations out there that are trying to do some really good work for many of the right reasons. But it really isn't sustainable and doesn't address the bigger picture, right? So these approaches can unintentionally create dependency, overlooking the root cause of poverty, and sometimes even reinforce power imbalances, as mentioned earlier, right? And then here's the real problem is charity funding can prioritize what the donors want, the board of directors want, which usually reflects the dominant discourse, which is, I want to feel good about giving money, or that deserving poor versus the undeserving poor mentality. So it's really, I'm very cautious about that, very aware of it. It's very politicized, and we need to be aware of all of that. For example, grants might also favor flashy, innovative new projects over the more boring, basic programs that have been tried and true for years. And I see that all the time. Many of the grants out there are looking for innovation and new programs when we're just trying to starve and keep the ones that work alive. Yeah, it looks like Haley has some thoughts on this as well.
Mhm.
Oh, I have so many thoughts. It's about to get so Marxist in here. Yeah, no, I think like I have some points like to go off of some of the things Sherry was just saying, but yeah, the innovation piece that you just brought up is so interesting to me. I have a bit of an obsession with this. Like, there's a word for it. It's like, what is it called? It's like not technocracy. It's about like the need to sort of apply technology where it does not belong, basically just because it's cool. And anytime I see one of those articles about like putting homeless people in fucking pods or something, it makes me so angry. I was like, why did you build a pod? Why didn't you build a house? Why are there pods? And even like Laurier's user experience program here in Brantford did like this huge social enterprise about making backpacks that like turned into tents and stuff. And I was like, okay, sure, you could just give these people tents, because like I don't know really what the difference is going to be with if they can put it on their back or not. And so much money, it was so much money went into it, right? And hours and hours of work for these user experience students. And yeah, people don't want these like sort of simple solutions that we already know work because they aren't glamorous. And yeah, that is one of my biggest pet peeves, and I'm so glad that you brought it up. And I think kind of going back to the original question, something that both business and charity solutions require is that you have to trust that the rich people are going to care for poor people. And I don't know about you, but I don't have that trust. And then I think, these charity-based solutions and nonprofits, you're adding more gatekeepers, and then you're creating a reliance on these organizations that are doing so much of the gatekeeping. And one of the readings from week 9, called Death by Charity, it points out that charity is a really important tool of capitalism. Like, it's not just that it, came about after capitalism, it's not that it's simply, compatible, it's actually a product of it. And its existence enables the continued power of capitalism. And I'm so sorry to do this to you, Will, but my example is Tim Hortons. So in this they actually give the example, Tim Hortons has many charitable organizations that aren't really, viewed as incongruent with its business. So we see, the children's camps, and they fund these sports leagues, and we see that as really positive. But Tim Hortons pays minimum wage, and they have over time gotten rid of paid breaks and benefits plans. So it's a corporation that sends, 20,000 kids from low-income households to camp, but then it's employing people and keeping them in poverty that way, right? So it's so strange to redistribute wealth like this so that some rich person can feel good about giving a gift rather than the obligatory wages that should come with work. So the authors also describe charity as a distraction from the immorality of inequality, and it's like simply kind of as a balm that functions on the individual level. So it kind of just soothes things just enough that we forget and maybe ignore certain things. And I think that this is a perfect explanation, but also as social workers, we have to contend with the fact that we rely on this balm for our clients who are suffering right now and have needs right now. So yeah.
And yeah, I never even thought about how that like redistribution of wealth can like where that goes, right? Like you hear all these good things, but yeah, very valid point. We keep these low income workers like at this level, and while it's good that this is happening in the one area, like we're blind to the fact that these changes haven't occurred in others. But Belinda and Sherry, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, this right away, the words fickleness of the donor and exploitation comes to mind. And I'm not going to expand on that, but I will leave that for the listener to kind of sit with and chew on and say, are we exploiting those that are already being exploited, those that are already oppressed, with efforts to rescue them? And the rescue them, I say, is in a very negative way, because we're not providing solutions. We're providing band-aids. We're not lifting them out of poverty. We're just helping them barely survive. And so those things I hope people can wrestle with. I want to go back to Justin Chan's lecture. Belinda mentioned Justin Chan earlier, and it was in week 10, and he came in from the community company. And he spoke about social enterprises as an alternative funding model for charities. And the first thing I want to establish is that we know that funding models are really, really, really fragile. They're unreliable. They are dynamic in nature. They come and go with the political structure as soon as it changes, and news and dominant discourse. So there's so many things that influence how things are being funded. And so the need to create self-sustaining models for these charities is rising, right? And that actually would be a very noble idea by for example, the neoliberal ideology would absolutely say, hey, yeah, exactly, take care of yourself, which goes back to that bootstrap mentality, right? So I'm saying that there's good things about what's happening out there, that if they can create other income streams that are self-sustaining, at the same time, we're saying basically pull up your bootstraps and provide your own funding for your own charities, which could create a lot. That's a whole other conversation. So that's an area that certainly is worth a discussion. The other, when we really need to be pointing back to systems that need to be committed, fully committed to what they say they're committed to. If they're committed to alleviating poverty, then every layer of our political system should be committed to alleviating poverty, including tax incentives for businesses and things like that, which leads me into Dennis Raphael's lecture, where he makes really powerful points, and he argued that markets and businesses have far too much control over our social programs, and we know that just through their voting power alone, they're influencing our social programs, right? And then that's the biggest problem that Raphael's lecture sort of highlighted with respect to the funding models. And social programs shouldn't be dictated by profit motives. So they should be in the hands of the state, a state that serves all its citizens,
Right.
not just the interest of the businesses. So as we see the percent of our population increasingly struggle with economic disparity, does that mean as we become more vulnerable economically, that we now lose our voice, that we no longer matter, that we no longer have a vote in Parliament? Absolutely not. Their vote matters just as much. So at what point does that scale tip? Do they want more?
Absolutely.
Do we get 51% of us all poor before they actually listen to those that are affected by poverty?
Hmm. Belinda, do you have something that you wanted to share?
We can move on if
Okay.
people are ready. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, moving on. Our next area of topic, capitalism and its alternatives. So the question, how does capitalism contribute to poverty broadly? Sherry?
My notes from the master document changed, so I don't know where they are.
So, Haley, do you have something you want to start with?
Yeah, I think that capitalism itself is built on inequities, and it's been built on, like as we discussed earlier, it's been built on the historic and ongoing legacies of inequality of class, gender, ethnicity, and this type of economy has always relied on a class of people that are forced to work for meager wages or none at all. We're getting real Marxist right off the back again. It like capitalism actively requires extraction from people, particularly vulnerable people, in order to function well, essentially. So poverty is inherent to this system from my perspective and from the perspective of many. So, and then on top of like relying on it, the system contributes to further inequity. So if you look, and this is sort of a little bit of economics, but if you look at the difference between like capital and labor, so someone born with wealth or capital like land, for instance, they can use capital as collateral to invest in other things. So you can, if your parents leave you a house, you can buy another house with that as collateral. And that is sort of how a lot of like real estate moguls get into it, right? They're not making wages. They aren't actively working hours and contributing to society, but their potential for wealth, so like what's in that house, is considered more valuable than a middle class employee who's planning to work for their whole life. So employees can't invest their future earnings. They have to save and then they can invest. And you can't go to the bank and get a loan solely based on your future ability to work. You have to like prove that you're going to work, and you have to prove that you can save, and you have to have savings. So all of this means that like people who are actually working and doing labor are just making other people rich, and but can't actually like do anything with the money that they have or will have. And I saw a quote online once that was absolutely perfect. Is like, to be a rich capitalist, you actually need a lot of money to start with. So in order to even succeed, you kind of just need to have that money immediately. So how can anybody really ever compete in this system?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, it's kind of like that Donald Trump quote. I started out with a small loan from my father of $1 million. Like, yeah, that's sure. That's probably like, I think that quote is like from a few years ago. So that number is probably going to be much larger now in comparison. But yeah, you really do need to have a lot of money to start out, and not everybody does. And that system really works against them when they don't. Yeah.
I mean,
Um,
capitalism, I'll comment briefly on those, and then you can do what you want with them. Capitalism, how do we challenge capitalism? Is that where we're at?
how does capitalism contribute to poverty broadly?
Okay. I think capitalism spins a dominant narrative that creates a value system that you are not successful in this westernized world unless you believe, like a religion, in capitalism, and which has been exclusionary, especially for the indigenous peoples of our country, or this country, or should I say their country. They didn't ascribe to capitalism, and the response has been genocide. So let's think about it from a poverty perspective, if you're in a poverty state or state of poverty and you're not subscribing to capitalism, I have a hard time believing the agenda. This sounds very, very radical, but I have a hard time believing that there is a ton of goodwill in a state that believes capitalism is like a religion. I think they're not above a discrete but very obvious form of genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And that's radical. It basically says, we'll look good on the surface, but we hope that this mess goes away and we don't want to see it anymore. And if they fade away and unfortunately die from poverty, then I suspect we live in a country that might very well turn their eyes away from it.
Okay, so that kind of leads into our next question. How do we challenge capitalism?
So one way that capitalism contributes to poverty broadly is in order for government to fund like a nonprofit or charity or some type of organization, it's measured by using a capitalistic measure. That's what Raphael's lecture discusses about health promotion and welfare states. So again, you have to get your organization measured by using capitalism, so like quantitative measure in order to get funding, for instance. So due to capitalism and people constantly buying products, for instance, it's Cyber Monday. They're destroying the environment and indirectly furthering people into poverty. If we better take care of the environment and educate people, to gain natural resources that are not accessible economically could help. As well as, to challenge capitalism, we have to encourage reflection, to stop, think before just buying instantly, like buy, consume, right? An approach that disrupts capitalism. And I'm sure a lot of people can talk on this as well.
Yeah, I know one big gaming company tried this tactic where they released content and said, "Oh, it's on sale right away." And they said it was like marked at a reduced price, when in actuality that was the release price and they were just putting a sales tag on it. That's super illegal, and they didn't get in trouble for it. They just removed the pricing and made it honest, and people still bought into it. But yeah, super, like, even those like legal practices like Cyber Monday are super scummy because they prey on like the idea of a good deal, and that can really sink people even further because those good deals aren't what's good for them. Sherry, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think there's a shocking irony to all of this, and that is, of course, we're living in an age where we constantly are discussing climate change and our environment as a critical factor, and that's all areas of our society have that concern, and yet we still drive capitalism and consumption. So I think those two contradict each other, first of all, because it's the extraction of resources, it's the manufacturing processes that are largely at fault for the climate changes that we face now. And then there's the irony here, and I think this is very local irony, and it's a very sad part of this. These are goods by and large that we see, consume on Cyber Monday or Black Friday, and they end up in the garbage, or at least last year's items end up in the garbage. And where is our encampment? Where is the tiny home community situated? Well, there's a large, significant, decentralized community that's right next to the Waterloo Region garbage dump. Why is it there? I would say most likely because houses don't want to be there. So we would put the people out of sight, out of mind, and right next to the garbage dump. I think it just speaks volumes to what society feels and thinks about people that are struggling economically.
Haley?
Yeah, I think in class we've talked about how, we can't overthrow capitalism overnight as much as we would like to. But I think for me, it's important to think about change that I can kind of enact in the shorter term. And for me, some of this means, like supporting businesses that have good practices and human rights values, and like local businesses as well, as much as possible. But for example, like I go to my hairdresser because I love my hairdresser, but I also aggressively recommend her business to everyone I know. Her and her husband take very like transparent salaries from the business rather than profits, and they include their employees in business decisions and like actively reinvest profits to benefit everyone who works there. So like not just themselves. And so like for instance, it's pretty uncommon, for like once a business starts over like 7 years to have not lose any employees. All of their employees have stayed for the 7 years they've been open. They haven't lost like a single hairdresser, a single barber, no one. And it's pretty uncommon for small businesses to have comprehensive benefit plans, and they have saved their profits in a way that they were able to do this. So, all of the hairdressers, they have benefits plans, paid time off, sick days, all of that. And so like I feel good about going there, and wildly, it still is not as expensive as many hair salons. So, I think about that all the time, and I think another way, a small way to like kind of address capitalism, is by challenging and encouraging those who are involved in small businesses, and who have power to make change directly in how they run things. And like my partner and his dad own a small business, and we have conversations all the time about valuing employees beyond the profits that they bring to the company, and like valuing them as an individual, whether they clearly produce like a monetary value or not. And more significantly, I think I kind of had this moment last summer where I wondered like what would happen if businesses operated more like they were a contributing community member rather than solely a business here to make profit. And so like they would have responsibilities to the community, like, and something my partner did at their business this year is they hired a young woman who's grown up in poverty at the business. And like, to be honest, she probably doesn't make them a lot of money. She's like does her work and whatnot, and she doesn't plan on staying there forever. She's got high hopes for herself, but he's teaching her important skills and giving her resources that in the long run actually like, contribute to the entire community we live in, right? Like she's gonna be able to support her family. She plans to like learn a trade, so like support her family, her siblings, break that cycle of poverty. This is something that actually benefits like all of us in the community, right? And imagine if more local businesses thought that way. So instead of trying to extract the maximum amount of labor from employees, they were thinking about, longer term things like how can I ensure that this person gives back to the community in a real way.
Very insightful. And yeah, again, you're bringing up all these points that I've never really considered. Like if these businesses were an attributing community member rather than just a business looking for profit, I think that would make such a huge impact. And that would create such change that it's unfathomable. Sherry?
Yeah, it's interesting that my son was recently talking about the loss of mentoring. And I think it's part of the individualistic society. I think it's part of the competition that capitalism has created for us. And it's been replaced, and he said, and I thought it was very profound, he says, I think mentoring, authentic investing in another human being's well-being so that they can develop the skills and knowledge that they need for making a living has been replaced with the assumption that institutions like colleges and universities will take care of this mentoring for us. And the reality is what we've done is essentially say we no longer need individuals to invest in us. We're going to trust an institution that is by nature driven by profit, rather than somebody that's authentically concerned about our well-being. So I thought that was pretty profound of them. And what another thought came to mind was the idea that, and we keep hearing this, especially when I think of truth and reconciliation, call to actions, um, and certainly we hear it again and again, the idea of do nothing for us without us. And we hear that statement in community work, and I think it's very applicable here. The challenge is that if somebody is struggling economically, and we have the understanding that they're feeling in a place of great unsafety, they're at risk, and so they're maybe not functioning as at their maximum intellectual capacity. And we invite them into these conversations and say, well, we had you come into City Hall, we had you talk, but you didn't contribute in a meaningful way. You had nothing to contribute. If we had that same person coming from a universal basic income situation where they had experienced poverty, however, their needs were met, they felt safe, they felt composed, they were fed that day, they had a good night's sleep the night before, their health care was met. And we invite them into that same community discussion at City Hall. I think that you would find that we have some very significant conversations happening with some real solutions. So I think we need to make sure that we're including these voices in a meaningful way and not exploiting them or just making a token effort. And that also leads us back to things like research, right? Participatory research that authentically involves their voices and that the research is meaningful to their communities, not something that meets the resume needs or the academic aspirations of the research team. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave it today. We need to provide a safe foundation so that they can speak and advocate and build their capacity to do so. How empowering, how authentically social work is that when we say they have the solutions, we just make sure that they feel safe enough to help contribute to them.
Well, Linda.
Just to hit it home, we're going to talk about for critical hope, right? The next point.
Yep.
But in our last lecture, again, I'm going to quote Jeanette, look at what scholarship tells you, like those who come from blue collar class, they come with education and they are the hardest on their clients compared to being in a lower class or middle class. People with higher class do not have the same built up empathy. Class dictates how a person will behave. Again, this is like it connects to capitalism. Sometimes it does not mean in a good way. Having that conservative mindset of bootstrapping, that I walked here and worked to get here. I pushed through things to get here, and you can too. Something that I'm hoping to read over the break is the scholarship that Jeanette recommended, Adam Smith, Wealth of the Nation and Marxism. You know, that bootstrapping does not take into the white factor, that this myth of the American dream.
And yeah, I think what you, Belinda and Sherry have discussed is like really important. Like we need to like acknowledge these things, that this idea of like the American dream and like and is like false, and we need to like start setting up like a safe foundation for people to advocate for themselves, because that's like the way things are going to change, is if the people who need the change to happen advocate. So the last point, or the last topic of discussion for our podcast today, critical hope and advocacy, future directions. Does anybody have anything that they want to discuss?
Yeah, I think like generally speaking, like I think we all need to practice leveraging our privilege when these issues come up, even when it's uncomfortable and requires sacrifice. I think of a recent example where one of my partner's friends was in a work meeting and the owner of the company explicitly declared that they would not be promoting a particular employee because of their gender. And this was a meeting of all men, and the conversation, around it is, like, yeah, that's very messed up, but then uncertainty about kind of what to do after that. And I think it's uncomfortable to take action. Like, you'll cause conflict, you might have to quit, maybe you'll lose your job, but the alternative is sort of that this woman will never know and what was said in this meeting, and she'll be underpaid and undervalued at that company for years based on her gender. So I think we need to stay critical, continue to reflect on the shortcomings of charity-based solutions and the problems that come with the nonprofit industrial complex, but also be realistic, knowing our clients need these services that are offered by these organizations. Charities and nonprofits are not necessarily aligned with social justice, and we need to be able to differentiate these from those that are. And keep focusing on connecting with our communities and not dealing with the frustration that comes with these social problems alone, highlighting the little wins, thinking of actions and change as seeds, as Jeanette has talked about, seeds that will grow long after we're retired and gone, and engage in those practices of critical hope. Think of it as something to be practiced, but also allowing ourselves to feel the really hard emotions that come with advocacy and that intense frustration. In terms of specific future practice for myself, I imagine a fair amount of attention will need to shift towards climate change and environmental concerns, like Sherry brought up a little while ago. But in week 4, we had a reading that discussed the vulnerability of the Aboriginal health system to climate change. And the authors discussed about how climate change is going to further exacerbate inequities because environmental consequences don't have equal effects on all populations. And so, capitalism, poverty, and climate change are all interconnected. And for me, this means expanding my work into the area of eco-social work.
Sherry, do you have any thoughts?
It's very hard following Haley because that was very, very insightful. I really appreciate what you had to say. And when I stand back and I look at the whole poverty issue, I think my biggest takeaway is that it's not a siloed issue. We can't treat it as that. It's intersectional through social location, but it's also cross sections and multi-layered, and very much we need to no longer take a siloed approach to it, realizing it's showing up in so many different areas. What are the poverty policies in a hospital for those who are economically challenged, right? We need to address policies within policies to actually address this issue. And one of those, and we need to stop treating it like it doesn't connect with other social challenges, because one of the biggest conversations I've been following more recently is the conversation around the idea that adverse childhood experiences, so the ACEs scores, for example, don't include poverty as an ACEs. So although ACEs, the whole framework of adverse childhood experiences and the scoring system influences policy at many levels, and including services for mental health and identifying at-risk groups, what we don't say is, what if we plug in poverty as part of that equation? What if we remove poverty from those affected by ACEs? Could we actually prevent ACEs in many cases? So that's a huge conversation that needs to happen, because a family that's stressed economically is reactive. We've already talked about cognitive capacities changing depending on our stress level. So imagine a family that absolutely doesn't have to worry about a food or a roof. Their families feel safe at night. How much better can mom and dad do at raising their families in a safe way where these ACEs scores would then be reduced significantly? And that actually ACEs directly talks to social determinants of health as well, but they just don't pair them together. And I think there's a lot of conversations that need to start communicating to each other. So I think that's my biggest takeaway. As I move into my social work practice, the next steps and stages for me, I work with adults who have lived with developmental trauma. Most of these adults have significantly high ACEs scores and are living the effect of that, which includes many social barriers, many barriers in their job places, economic barriers, and so forth. So I am never going to be able to look at poverty as a distinct issue on its own.
Very good points to bring up, Sherry. Belinda, did you have anything you want to discuss?
Yes, but I'm also going to bring it back to Sherry. So Sherry, I want you to think about, because we were discussing this earlier when we were trying to plan this podcast. How would you explain poverty to children? In one of our last course materials, Ruth Bergman's TED Talk, she discusses how addressing poverty is beneficial for all people and not just poor people. You know, the key points you can make in advocacy and macro level, it lessens the system by creating revenue and tax dollars to be used in other ways. As Sherry was talking about this advocacy and bootstrapping and the ACEs score, how would you conceptualize that for a child? I guess is what I'm going to try to turn to her, because I feel like she has so many good, insightful points on this.
Oh, it's really tough because we're getting off of the course material when we spin it in this direction, and it has been rich material for sure. But yeah, opening it up and saying, speaking to the next generation, how are we going to talk to them about poverty, and in a way that honors all human dignity and reduces future stereotypes and stigma that has only served to further oppress people, right? So I know Belinda and Haley and Will, we were once, when we were first planning this out, I just threw out the idea, there's children's books, right? So that would be one way that it could be done. Think about entertainment media and the amount of communication that could happen through cartoons or movies and things like that. So the mainstream media, I think, has a responsibility, not just a critical role, but an actual responsibility to reduce stigma across the board for all areas that oppress.
And to go off that, Sherry, I can think of a number of examples of like cartoons and TV growing up when I was a kid that I can still remember to this day that are examples of like huge topics like racism and sexism and things like that. And I think that's huge because that shows how much of an impact those kind of mediums can have on a kid. But I think another way too, like say if I was working with kids in the school board for my placement, and I'm talking about poverty, it's like, okay, everybody gets a Hot Wheels car. You have a toy car now. Now, some of you are going to get toy remote control cars. You still have a toy car, but there's our remote control cars, which are cooler and more fun to play with. Now, two of you are going to get those like little like rover cars that you can actually physically drive. Still a toy car, but again, a step up from the other toy cars that everybody else got. Everybody has a toy car, but is it the same? And I think that's a good analogy right there. Okay, so to wrap up, I think that we're kind of in a state where we may think, what if you can't do anything, but there's nothing you can, or sorry, what if you can't do nothing, but there's nothing you can do? You do what you can. And with that, this is the first and only episode of the Deserving and Undeserving podcast. I want to thank Haley, Sherry, and Belinda for dedicating their time to come together and speak on these topics. And Jeanette, thank you for all the wonderful insight you brought us in class. And with that, I'm going to have this drink, and good night.
Good night. Goodbye. I'm all out of wine, so.
I think I need a wine.
Woo!
We did it!
Okay, did you stop recording it yet?
I mean,
Oh
No.
shit, he forgot to record it.
Thank you for listening to the first and only episode of the Deserving and Undeserving podcast. This episode was brought to you by The Cold Side of the Pillow. We all want it, and we hope you get it tonight.